It gives me great pleasure, of course, to introduce Daniel Woolf, the 20th Principal of Queen's, the Vice-Chancellor. Surprisingly, I think in our 174 years of existence, our only third alumni to hold the position in our storied history. As you know, he's a historian, professor specializing in early modern British cultural history and the history of historical writing. Of course, he has a book, The Global History of History, published by Cambridge University Press in 2011. Since becoming principal in 2009, he's on to his second term as principal, but came here in 2009. He's certainly dealt with some really important issues here on the campus, mental health issues, in establishing the Principals Commission on Mental Health, leading to Initiative Campaign, the largest fundraising campaign, which we are doing really well with, and looking to touch down in 2016 for 175th. Of course, he's a member of the Royal Society of Canada, and maybe some things maybe that you do know, or maybe you don't know. He's a cat lover. If you follow him on Twitter, you know that he's a cat lover. A grammarian? Are you a grammarian? Is that the right word? I think that's something like that. And I've also had. It's all the other thing that Daniel does. One is he still teaches, a part-time teacher in the Department of History, which I think is phenomenal. The other thing that he does is he has a radio show on CFRC called Dark Glasses. And no matter where you are in this room, you can listen to it. It's 2:30s on Mondays. And, of course, all the shows are archived, so you can go back and listen to it, half-hour show. I've had the distinct pleasure of being a guest on Daniel's show, and I think he's kind of a neat thing to do. So without any further ado, Daniel Woolf.
Well, thank you very much, George, and good afternoon, everybody. And I want to thank you for giving up your weekend to come to campus. And I'm going to begin by saying something that I am sure you have heard many times before, but I think bears repeating, which is that without you, our alumni, Queen's would not be where it is today. Now, I actually don't mean that simply in the sense of you all being terrific volunteers, which of course you are, but I mean quite literally, without our alumni, Queen's would not be where it is today. In fact, we'd probably be in a certain city 150 miles west of here. So I'm going to put on my history hat here and take you back a little bit in Queen's history, near the beginning, to a principal who is little known today, but I happen to be a big fan of him among my predecessors. I mean, everybody of course knows Grant. I mean, 25 years, transformed the college into a national institution, deservedly celebrated, and so forth. How many of you can name the principal before Grant? Thank you. Who said that? Thank you, Allison. Correct. I'll take principals of Queen's for 40. So my wife and I have this running joke because I can't actually name all 19 of my predecessors and their dates, but she won't let me do it. She gives me the look if I threaten to do it, But when I was reading up on the history of the university when I was a candidate for my position a little over 6 years ago, I did happen to note the Snodgrass story, and it is a very interesting one. He was at the helm for 13 years, from 1864 to 1877, and he did not have an easy time. Queen's College in 1864 was relatively small, and it was in really serious trouble. First of all, Principal Snodgrass's predecessor, the Reverend William Leach, had died in office. And back then, succession planning was not exactly top of mind for small institutions. When he took on the helm, the university, or the college as it then was facing a terrible financial crisis. Not only had well, first of all, there was no funding from the government. We were a private, religious-based institution. Secondly, funding from the Scottish Presbyterian Church failed to materialize. Thirdly, there was a small endowment, but owing to the collapse of something called the Commercial Bank of Canada in 1864, that also vanished. So we weren't huge. There were only a few professors and a few hundred students, but the likelihood of survival didn't look very high at that time when Snodgrass took the reins. And there was this much larger university in Toronto dangling the possibility of a merger and becoming a college of U of T. But nonetheless, Snodgrass, rather than throw in the towel, turned to the group that he instinctively thought, though he actually wasn't an alum himself, in fact, had never been in Canada before. He came from Scotland, where he would eventually return. He actually turned to the Queen's alumni, which at that point in 1864, the place had only been around for 25 years, so there weren't scads and scads of alumni. But he did turn to them, and it was those alumni, a modest group in size, that came forward with the money he needed. And so whether or not those alumni recognized it at the time, they played an absolutely crucial role in the survival of their college and the university's future. And Snodgrass also established the University Council, because there was no alumni association back then, so that actually was more or less the alumni association. And that support from alumni has never stopped. So if you like, Snodgrass is kind of the setup guy for Grant. So when Grant was in his last months, and funding from the local farmers didn't come through for Frontenac Hall, I think I've told this story before, where you ask is Frontenac Hall. The local farmers did not give their money because Grant had taken a very sort of principled, no pun intended, stand against strict temperance. Well, the money got pulled by the local conservative farmers. So Grant, once again, following his predecessor's example, turned to the alumni and made the famous remark that the alumni of Queen's can always be counted on to see us through, and that's how Grant Hall, as it came to be known, came to be built. So, having done the history bit, I want to now set you at ease. I am not about to tell you that the university is teetering and is in desperate need of your support. We can still use your support, but actually things are looking a whole lot better than they looked for William Snodgrass through the 1860s and the early 70s. That being said, as we approach our 175th anniversary, I did want to stress that you all and the alumni you represent play a crucial role in helping us plot the future. You do this in a number of ways. Donations, most obviously, but a lot else. You help us recruit the next generation of students. And you volunteer. You're leaders representing Queens in your communities and organizations. And Carlin Roberts is here. Where are you, Carlin? Right here. Okay. Give you a wonderful example. I'm going off script here, but I was in Calgary on Thursday night, and for an event that both Carlin and I were at, along with a few other Queen's alumni in Calgary. It wasn't actually a Queen's event. It was a dinner of the Chemical Institute of Canada, where our distinguished Calgary alum, Kim Sturgis, Science 77, was receiving essentially a Lifetime Achievement Award. And you would have been hard-pressed to tell that it wasn't a Queen's event, because we pretty much took that place over. It's so much so that the MC, who was not a Queen's alum, at the closing confessed that, well, I'm not a Queen's alum, but my son is in first year engineering at Queen's. Now I'm beginning to get it. So You do other things. You're committed to helping educate your peers. For example, the Volunteer Mental Health Summit last fall. Alumni volunteers devote countless hours to making sure that we hear your perspective, and also to ensuring, as in that case the other night in Calgary, that your fellow alumni are celebrated on campus, across the country, and increasingly around the world. I know that Kellogg is here all the way from Hong Kong, so thank you for coming all that way, Kellogg. Kellogg and the Hong Kong alumni just gave me a fabulously warm welcome about a year and a half ago when I was last in Hong Kong, and we have a very, very energetic alumni chapter there. So this weekend's Volunteer Summit brings you all together under the able leadership, speaking of Calgary, of Jeremy Mosher and his Alumni Volunteer Summit Committee, and I want to thank Jeremy and everybody else who played a role in bringing us together this weekend. Where are you, Jeremy? Were you there on Thursday night? No. Sorry, I didn't think so. You had to be here. But so let me spend a few minutes updating you on some things that are going on campus. Particularly wanted to talk to you about the university's strategic framework. I want to talk to you a bit about internationalization. And of course, I'd like to bring you a bit of an update on the planned revitalization of Richardson Stadium. I'm also going to fill you in on an issue that I have to say, rather like mental health 4 or 5 years ago, has not been without its challenges, and that's the issue of sexual violence on university campuses. So, this past September marks for me 30 years since I made my first foray into teaching, which just so happens to have been here at Queen's. The AMS president that year, by the way, was one Enes van Nostrand. It's a name that may seem familiar to some of you. But now, we're a much bigger university than we were 20 years ago, approximately twice the size, and the challenges have changed. The last few decades have seen rapid shifts in economic conditions, massive technological changes, a number of us were just talking about them at lunch, as well as the globalization of education and knowledge. And at the same time, the university has chosen to go down a rather difficult path. And that's because rather than choosing to define ourselves as a primarily research-oriented institution, or primarily undergraduate teaching-focused institution, and there are exemplars on both sides of that fence, we've chosen to try to balance them both. And it's a little bit like walking across a tightrope and constantly having to make adjustments. But it is the reason why I like to call us the Balanced Academy, because we think that both the student learning experience, graduate and professional as well as undergraduate, and research excellence are fundamental to our identity. So not coincidentally, those two things, student learning experience, research prominence, are the first two pillars of what we call the strategic framework. How many of you are familiar with the strategic framework? Good, that's great. Well, a class that actually does its pre-reading. That's awesome. The framework is a board-approved document that it's essentially a planning tool to guide our path over the next 5 years to 2019, more or less coincidental with the end of my second term as principal. It didn't come out of nowhere. It is built on a number of previous plans that went through the Senate. Dr. Reeve over here was an architect of what we call the academic plan. He was on the committee of Senate that passed that a few years ago. We have a strategic research plan as well. We have a campus master plan. So I like to think of the strategic framework, and we call it a framework, not a plan, but I like to think of it as the one document to rule them all. Now the framework, and a couple of people in the room, such as Dan Tisch, were very, very helpful to the provost and me in laying out some very, very good metrics for this. It's driven by 4 pillars, or what we call strategic drivers. I've already mentioned the student learning experience, and I've mentioned research excellence or research prominence. But we also are focused on 2 other drivers: financial sustainability and internationalization. So you can have all the plans or frameworks in the world done up on very nice color glossy paper, but unless you can actually execute them once you have them, then they simply become documents that fill up a box or sit on a bookshelf until it's time to do the next one. We were quite determined not to do that, so we have asked, in a polite sort of way, that individual faculties and schools and service units around the university align their own priorities and goals to the strategic framework. So I'll give you an example. On the subject of internationalization, I am thinking particularly of the imperative for Queen's to become the sort of university known and respected worldwide. Because it seems clear to me that as global competition among universities increases over the next decade, it simply will not be sufficient to be the best known university in Kingston, Ontario. Or indeed one of the best known in Canada. There are actually some very compelling demographic reasons for this. The 18 to 25-year-old population is in a fairly sharp decline. The baby boom echo is through. A number of Ontario universities in particular last year took an enrollment bath, some up to 8 or 9% off their bottom line. We didn't. We came in pretty much where we should, a little high actually. But we don't ever want to be in a position of having to lower those rigorous standards that get us the best students in Canada. And the way you ensure that is by expanding the pool. And if the pool can't be expanded in Canada, then we have to look elsewhere. So there is actually a strategic imperative behind internationalization. But even if there were not, I still think it's the right road for us to go because, again, it simply isn't sufficient to be well known in Canada. It's particularly true for our younger alumni. Many of us more senior alumni have built careers, you have reputations, we're well known. But in that first 5 or 10 years after you graduate, your university name and its reputation, its brand, are essentially your credit card almost. It's like don't leave home without it. You are known by the currency of that university. And we have a very strong brand in terms of the graduates we produce and the Queen's experience. But we need to spread that more globally, and the way to do that is to have more international students. I will admit that we actually have been a little bit slow on the uptake compared to other institutions, but we are now actually very, very fully engaged on this. We have given targets to our units. We have made some structural changes, such as the separation of admissions out of the Registrar's Office, reporting directly to Dean and Vice Provost Dan Tierney, and with a designated international recruiter. This year, I'm pleased to say, we have students on campus representing 51 different countries from Australia to Yemen. Those students will, of course, eventually become alumni. And they can become ambassadors for Queen's when they return, as many of them will, to their home countries, or indeed go elsewhere in the world. We're working hard to target locations where we particularly want to attract students and build research partnerships at the same time. One of those hubs is East Asia, which is the reason, for example, that we recently launched a Chinese language website. And sometimes I'll get asked, okay, well, but surely they have to speak English to come here. I mean, they ought to be able to read the English website. Absolutely. But the Chinese website is not aimed at the students. It's aimed at the parents. The parents in China make those kinds of decisions where their kid is going to come, and they're not necessarily going to read English. I'm doing a fair bit of travel myself. I'm heading off to Japan in May to meet with Japanese researchers, industry, and university leaders, again, part of my role in raising the university's profile. But I do think that one of the major reasons for internationalization is also the experience at home. By increasing the number of international students who are here on campus, we increase the amount of diversity, we increase cultural awareness, and we can actually deepen the richness of the education that our domestic students receive. So it's all part of the student learning experience, as well as being obviously connected to research and our other drivers. Now, it goes without saying that one of the components of a happy and healthy student learning experience is a safe campus environment. And that brings me to the very serious issue of sexual assault. Last November, the Toronto Star published a series of articles calling out universities and colleges for not having specific standalone policies in place to deal with the issue of sexual assault or sexual violence. Now, as a matter of fact, we already had a sexual assault prevention and response working group in place that had been working for some time. However, in the light of those stories, I asked them to expedite their work and to develop some recommendations to enhance programs and initiatives related to sexual assault. So in mid-January, they released an interim protocol, and they're now meeting with various stakeholder groups on campus to get further feedback before developing an actual policy. So we've accomplished, I think, a fair bit on that file in a relatively short time. The protocol's been well received by student leaders, which is always a good sign that we're on the right track. And you may be aware that the Premier of Ontario, Kathleen Wynne, herself a Queen's alum, unveiled recently a 3-year plan to curb sexual violence and harassment, including a new law forcing colleges and universities to step up efforts to tackle the problem. So because of our work this past fall and early winter, we're actually ahead of that curve, and now other universities are actually looking to us, as they did a few years ago with mental health, for guidance as they shape their own policies. Finally, with our friend George Jackson, ex of the Golden Gales, in the room, I have to talk about Richardson Stadium. And the plans for its revitalization are now very well underway. We've been meeting with our neighbors and with student groups to share conceptual drawings and an architect's video showing what the stadium might look like. We do have a comprehensive website devoted to the revitalization project, along with feedback forms. And the project has definitely been a priority within our $500 million initiative campaign, which, as you know, wraps up this time next year. That campaign, the most successful so far, and it's not done yet in our history, has already helped to transform many areas of the university through projects like the expansion of Goods Hall at the Queen's School of Business, the construction of the new medical building, and of course, most recently, the Isabel Bader Center for the Performing Arts on the Kingston waterfront. And for those of you from out of town, if you have not actually seen the Isabel, I heartily recommend it. It is absolutely a spectacular facility. Campaign has also helped us increase student assistance. It's worth noting that alumni have given $60 million to the annual fund alone. That's not endowments, that's not capital, it's just the annual fund, since the campaign began in 2006. So there have certainly been some very, very significant big donations, but it is the smaller gifts, and particularly collective gifts, class gifts and so forth, that have really helped us get this close to the finish line. We're at about $481 million and change as of the day before yesterday. I didn't check the total this morning, but I have no doubt whatsoever that we're going to reach and exceed that $500 million goal before the end of the campaign a year from now. For me, the only question is, by how much over do we go? And speaking of finish lines, I am just about done here. I did want to note that the 2016-2017 academic year will mark our 175th anniversary. And that is perhaps appropriately sandwiched between two other major Canadian anniversaries. First of all, Sir John A. Macdonald's 200th birthday, which occurred this last January, and Canada's sesquicentennial, or 150th birthday, which we will mark in 2017. And I always like to think of Queens as the meat in the sandwich of Sir John A. and Canada. Peter Milliken, a long-serving MP and Speaker of the House of Commons, is chairing the advisory committee as we put our plans into place for our own celebrations in 2016-17. And David Walker, our former Dean of Health Sciences, who also chaired the Principals Commission on Mental Health, is heading up the committee responsible for actually executing the plans. I'm also very pleased to say, and here I go back to history, that 2016 will see the publication of the third volume of the Queen's history by Duncan McDowell, the university historian, a Queen's history grad of the late 70s and a former Carleton University history professor. And that's going to cover the years from 1961 to 2004. And I expect that many of us of that vintage will be able to see our own experiences depicted in its pages. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for coming. Thank you for everything you do. I regret very much that I cannot join you for this evening's festivities, but you have the great pleasure of having Chancellor Leach with you this evening. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
Also on that note of celebration, it's the 90th anniversary of the Alumni Association in 2016 as well.
All right,
So,
great. Awesome.
As you mentioned Snodgrass, is there any record of who those alumni were that made a contribution? Do you know?
Turn to our...
Maybe in the doomsday book.
It would be interesting to see.
That's a great question.
Yeah,
That is a great question. It is great. I'm sure there must be. I just don't know where it is. But again, because we weren't huge, it would be relatively probably a couple of hundred or so. Yeah.
Would you consider them were they were literally in your mind the first alumni who gave?
Well, I don't know if they were literally the first, because of course Sutherland was a bit later, actually, Robert Sutherland, but they would be pretty early on because it just wasn't something that was done at that point.
Good.
Yeah.
Questions for Daniel? Up in the back.
Principal Woolf, you talked about the third juncture of the university.
Yeah.
I'm curious, have you thought about what would be the fourth juncture? How do we prepare for it?
Well, that's a very good question, and the first and second ones occurred under Grant in the 1870s and 80s, and more about 100 years later under roughly the period from Macintosh through Deutsch, as we became much more of a graduate and research-intensive institution. The third juncture, I would argue, is now with all the massive transformations that are occurring in the world. And I would not make any predictions as to what the fourth one might be, but I will say the likelihood of it being upon us faster than the 50 years or so that separates us from the second is very, very high, because things are turning over much more quickly. We're not very good at predicting the future. In fact, if I were very good at predicting the future, I suspect I wouldn't be standing here right now. I'd be rubbing shoulders with Warren Buffett and and I'd probably be a donor rather than a principal. But yeah, but whatever they are going to involve. They are going to involve technological change. They are going to involve changes in work patterns among our young people. It's just really, really hard to say, but there will be one. Right now, my mind is concentrated on getting through the third one and coming out the other side a changed but still at the heart the same place. So building on our traditions but not bound by our traditions. Heather.
Daniel, when we were here, you know, videotape lectures were sort of a new thing, and
Sorry, what's videotape?
yeah. But now, as the university is sort of answering some of the other demographics that are out there with classes on on Apple TV and all the rest of it. What are some of the, like, maybe a couple of things that you would share with us in terms of things that you're thinking about with the teaching population here and with the kids?
Well, thank you very much for asking that. That's a great question. And we're actually more than thinking, we're actually doing a lot. And I'm really, really pleased. But when I got here about 6 years ago, the word virtualization was circling around, and wasn't too terribly popular. It had sort of I think people were quite afraid of it. You know, we're very residential. That interpersonal contact between professors and students is absolutely critical. But the fact of the matter is, young people today learn quite differently from, and I know we have a number of young alumni, they learn quite differently from the way we did. And we're well past the technology of just talking heads on a video capture. So we're actually doing some really interesting things, and here's a little boast on behalf of a couple of my administrative colleagues. For 2 years in a row, the Ontario government, which runs something called the Ontario Online Institute, which is intended to provide online courses to students to allow them to complete their degrees without necessarily having to go off to Athabasca, which is has owned the share for a long time of this market. So it has invited proposals from Ontario universities for essentially online courses. 2 years in a row, the most successful institution at getting these awards was Queen's. In fact, this last year, we got 20 out of 96. That's 20 out of 96 among 20 institutions, including some much larger ones. So we are more than just thinking about or experimenting with this. We are right there in the forefront, and I think that's appropriate, because when people again say that, well, we can't possibly offer education to students who are off campus, they say, well, look at what we did 100 years ago. We invented continuing education in Canada. There was an ex-premier of Alberta from Bill Aberhart, whose degree came from Queen's by extension. Now that was Pony Express snail mail at that point, but we do have a tradition of doing that. We're doing that in the class. We're doing it in the classroom here in terms of hybrid or blended models of learning. On the outside, this actually helps financial sustainability, because with our new budget model, we need to be able to generate additional revenue from outside the university without necessarily increasing the on-campus undergraduate population. We're in a small city. We're on a relatively confined campus. We cannot infinitely grow our undergraduate population, so we have to find other ways of attracting students from elsewhere to do courses here, so that we can get that revenue. I could go on and on about this, but I'll move on.
So with the recent strikes at York and UT among the teaching assistants, the whole conversation about teaching at universities, who's teaching, what the system is like, how, and our stance of teaching and research prominence, what does that discourse mean to Queen's now, and how are we positioned to have that?
Well, thank you. I mean, I come back to the challenge I mentioned of being a balanced academy. We are roughly twice the size as when I was here as an undergraduate. We certainly haven't grown our faculty numbers by twice. Moreover, our faculty members are working as hard as they ever did, but the balance between teaching and research has clearly shifted, because the road to international recognition to some degree lies in good teaching, and that is part of our brand, as I mentioned earlier. but the biggest metric is on research output and so forth. So there's no question that having to balance those two interests is a challenge. We have made up some of that with adjuncts, some of it with more TAs. We are not alone in this. This is actually pretty much true of every other institution. It's true of Toronto. It's true of smaller places as well. And there's no question that that's a challenge. And I don't have a ready answer to that one, except that whatever else we do, we've got to make sure that our students continue to have a positive experience here, which is actually demonstrated empirically so far by something we call the National Survey of Student Engagement. So we actually do have numbers that show that our students are having a positive experience. But we still have some work to do in the classroom. There's no question. Classes are bigger than they used to be. We don't have as many full-time faculty teaching as we would have 30 or 40 years ago. So that's, if you like, part of the change that's hit the whole higher education system in Canada over the last 20, 25 years.
Do you have time for one more?
Sure.
One more question?
Yeah.
I'll ask a question just about international recruitment.
Yeah.
So we're currently Australia to Yemen, so we've got to target Zambia, clearly.
That's right. I was thinking that as I spoke.
But maybe you could give us a perspective, though, on how that massive challenge of identifying key markets where we can actually hope to attraction and impact competitive leaders.
So we actually are working on, and actually our board of trustees in which Dan sits will be seeing a version of that at the May meeting in about a month's time. We have identified 3 strategic hubs. East Asia, I've mentioned, is one. The U.S., particularly the northeastern U.S., is another. And Britain is the third, because of course we have the castle there. Now the point of the hubs is not that those are the only places we're going and we're not interested anywhere else, far from it. But in order to get some early lift to this recruitment, we need to focus our resources, which are not infinite, strategically. So that's where disproportionately we are focused. Of course, we're active in other places, South Asia, India and Bangladesh, for example. We're active in other parts of the States. We're active in other parts of Europe. Those are the 3 that we're sort of asymmetrically funding. There are some other areas I'd like to begin to look at. Africa is very clearly one. There's a rising population which is underserved by universities, partly because I don't think we can rely on the Chinese market indefinitely. China's universities, of which there are many, many more than there were 10 years ago, are increasingly in direct competition. They didn't used to have more than a couple of very good universities. Now they've got a whole bunch, and that's a market we can't rely on indefinitely. So while that's the focus right now, we are in search of what is going to be the next strategic source of students. I think South America is another market I think that bears looking at.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.